Welcome to NeLI Pod, the official podcast of the National eDiscovery Leadership Institute. Hi, I'm Daniel Gold, your co-host and navigator through the evolving landscape of eDiscovery.
And my name is Brandon Mack. I'm the co-host of our podcast. Our guests, from judges to eDiscovery professionals, share insights that cater to all experience levels.
Whether you're looking for a broad overview or in-depth technical analysis, this podcast is your gateway to understanding and implementing effective eDiscovery practices.
It's important to note the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individual guests and the host, and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers.
We're here because of our passion for eDiscovery and our commitment to providing free, accessible educational content to legal professionals everywhere. And welcome back to another episode of the National eDiscovery Leadership Institute podcast. I am Daniel Gold, and joining me as always is my co-host Brandon Mack. Today, we are excited to actually welcome back to the program Steve Davis. Steve is the Vice President of Forensics and Investigations Practice over at Purpose Legal. Steve was with us last year, and we are bringing him back here to the program because the world of forensic investigations continues to evolve really at a breakneck pace. I know that firsthand, my daily practice that I have as well. Brandon, you have seen that on your end, and really what we want to be able to accomplish here today is really to be able to dig into this shift that's happening with digital evidence collection, the challenges of massive data growth, the complexities of encryption and deletion, and of course, what would an episode be on NeLI Pod without talking about how AI is changing the forensic game as well. Plus, we really want to hear why Steve keeps coming back to NeLI. So with that, Steve, welcome to the program. Let's go ahead and jump in. How are you today, sir?
Doing well, and good to see you both. Consider you colleagues and friends, and always enjoy crossing paths with you, whether it's a podcast or seeing you at shows around the nation.
Well, and that's why we like you very much, Steve, and we consider the same with you. Steve, when you were on the show last year, we discussed the challenges of collecting data and investigations. I want to understand for all of the NeLI Pod community, what is different this year? What are you seeing now in terms of the shift towards other types of digital evidence? And really, how is that changing the way forensic investigators are approaching their work?
Yeah, and I think that things change. I mean, you can pick a time frame, whether it's a day, a week, a month, a year, over the last 20 years, but it is as dynamic a landscape that we deal with when we talk about acquisition, identification of data, and then normalization and getting it into our grubby little fists so that we can slice and dice it and do the things we want to do with it. And the funny thing is, depending on the flavor of the data or the physical device at hand, things can change literally a week or a month from what we did previously. We may use a certain tool or a technique or a methodology, and then the next day you try it and it doesn't work. And that kind of seems like a recipe for failure. But I think what it really does is make us very in tune to what's out there and what is changing. So you've got to be a student of the game. You can't arrive, you can't acquire gray hair or beard and think that you're there. You've got to keep your hand on the pulse and constantly listen and learn. And it's a reason why a lot of us listen to podcasts and go to seminars and read books and articles and you name it, because the exchange of information at those places is helping us become better at what we do. But whether it's email changes like Purview and the change that Microsoft 365 and the entire ecosystem has made recently, or it's mobile device data and third-party apps, they change, and they change sometimes unknowingly to us on the end that are utilizing the tools. It's like having a screwdriver or a hammer that all of a sudden doesn't do what you thought it did a week or two ago. And so you've got to come up with some pretty creative ways to do things MacGyver-like.
Yeah, Steve, there's a lot there. And one of the things I want to ask about is with the change in data types, collaboration platforms, messaging applications, social media, we've always seen, and we're used to the fact that the amount of data being generated just keeps ballooning year over year. But now we're also seeing the diversity of the types of data doing the same thing, which creates this larger problem, at least from what I can see. When it comes to that, how do you help with consulting your clients and telling them you got all this different data, all these different types of data, all these different locations in which it's stored? How do you help them understand what's really necessary and important to their investigations and how to build a plan to collect only what they're really going to need in that kind of ocean of data that's out there?
Yeah, that's a better question than probably the answer is going to be. But I think we've kind of gone from, if you think of the 80-20 rule, right? We're all familiar with that in our lives. Like, 80% of effort, and 20% of your effort, ends up being 80% of your income or your benefit or whatever. Same thing here is like we used to think that corporate email was the treasure trove. That's where all the important data was. And attorneys would call me and say, "Hey, I've got 20 gigs of data." And maybe they did, or maybe they didn't really think through your very thoughtful question, which is, have we thought about all three legs of the stool? Have we thought about all the individuals that are involved? And then we thought about the time frames and whether migration comes into play for these different data sources and physical devices. And then specifically, the third leg of the stool is, what are people using? Are they using iPhones? Are they using Android? Are they using collab platforms like Jira or Confluence or Zoom or Teams or third-party apps? Is it WeChat or WhatsApp, or is it Snapchat or Viber or Facebook Messenger? All those ingredients that go into the pie or the recipe you're making matter. And I think what it really begs the issue is, and I say this to attorneys all the time, they're super bright people, brighter than I am, but sometimes they don't understand the idiosyncrasies that we're up against as investigators and forensic collectors. Not because they're bad people, not because they're not educated, just because they don't live in that space. And so I think your question kind of laid out the path to the answer, which is, I think you need to take a step back, and I think you need to have a plan in place. And so every time someone calls me, I usually shoot them kind of a high level 30,000 foot template for how we're going to go about slaying the dragon. And in the case of mobile device or third-party apps, it deals with platform, it deals with size of data, because you make a really, really good point, Brandon, which is, data volumes. I always make the joke about my first computer was 20 megabytes. Literally, my first computer was 20 megabytes. Now, right, every kid at our house and everyone else's house has multiple terabytes of data on a laptop or on an external hard drive, because that's how databases work. It's how pictures work. It's how graphics work. It's how music works. It's how content works. And if you're in like construction law, I mean, just think of all the CAD drawings and things like that that come with it. It has exploded, and just taking that data and dumping it into a funnel becomes a huge error, both economically and then systemically, because trying to get to the goal line or find the truth or get the answer or determine culpability, you can't do that if you have to wade through all the muck. You've got to be more finite. So I think you have to have a template or a recipe, in place, a plan of action up front. And then you got to make conscious choices about mitigating or minimizing extraneous or unnecessary data points or endpoints.
I love your answer. And by the way, as you were speaking, you're giving your answer, Steve. I'm envisioning the slides that I've seen you present before on this topic. And by the way, if you want to see a great presentation on digital forensic evidence collection, you have to see Steve Davis's presentation. I am going to give you a plug on that one, sir, because you really give a very dynamic, very educational presentation on this content in a way that speaks to every person, regardless or irrespective of their knowledge base level in this area. And I say that very authentically and very genuinely because you really do deserve it. 'Cause I think you really do give phenomenal presentations. And so let's segue from that answer that you gave, because it almost seems cliche, Steve, to say this, that data volumes continue to get larger, as you talked about. But it's not just the data volumes you talked about. You rambled off a half a dozen or maybe a dozen different apps. So file types are growing, I would maybe say proportionally or even greater than the data volumes. So what are some of the practical challenges that you face when you're working with a client, when you're trying to filter and collect from these larger data sets and data types and balance thoroughness, importantly, with the reality that you're literally just not going to collect everything. And people have to really understand that. So how does that work, Steve?
Yeah, I think what I call it the difference between linear and nonlinear. So linear could be like a standard operating system on your PC or your MacBook. And on that operating system, you have loose files you can get to. And they're pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward. They're self-contained. They have a start and an end, a header and a footer. And for a forensic analyst or an investigator, it's like the four corners of a document during a review. You can get there, you can, compartmentalize it and get to it. I think what you're speaking of are those things that are a little more amorphous, things like collaboration sites, which in many times are built off of JavaScript. And so we see output called JSON files. And JSON files are standard output from Java, but that doesn't mean they're consistent from platform to platform. So the fields are radically different if you're in HipChat versus WhatsApp necessarily. And then if you get into structured data types where you think Oracle or SAP or SQL, SQLite, which is the predicate for a lot of mobile devices, those are housing primarily content, textual information, adjunct features like attachments and things, and you've got to extract out of that area the data that you want, whether it's the messaging, whether it's email, whether it's any type of communication, or it's geolocational information, or it's system settings and configuration. So I think those are very complex areas because they don't play well with downstream e-discovery platforms. We all know the famous ones that are out there that people review data in, and they're great products in and of themselves, but they're pretty basic in terms of what they allow. And so you have to parse or normalize this data, things like collaboration platforms, things like structured data, whether it's a medical records management system or whether it's a collaboration platform that people are sharing content with between channels and messaging. You have to get the data out of that, and then you've got to create a way for it to get imported into a platform that makes it look attractive. It's so funny, but whether it's a practitioner, a lawyer, a witness, an investigator, we love the way iPhone looks, right? I mean, it's got to have the right emoji. It's got to have, the blue or the green, depending on if you're in or out of my network. I mean, that's the way we think mentally, but the reality is it's just bits and bytes, right? It's zeros and ones. And so it doesn't come out that way. I got asked the other day at a conference I spoke at, and they're like, well, how do you prepare for the change in emojis over time? And I said, not my problem. That's a you problem. And I was speaking to somebody that's associated with a platform, an end platform for eDiscovery, because I'm collecting bits and bytes. I'm collecting zeros and ones and giving it to you. And the representation of a happy face or whatever emoji there is really just code behind it. So it doesn't create a problem for the forensic investigator or collector. It creates a problem downstream to the people representing it. So I think to answer your question, we're dealing with so many things that aren't linear anymore. We're dealing with nonlinear. And those things like structured databases, those things like third-party chat apps, and those things that surround just, large databases and partitions. Those are the things that we got to extract content out that could have probative value, but won't necessarily be round peg to round hole, right? It'll be square peg that we've got to change or normalize.
That's interesting, and seeing those things as downstream problems. The interpretation of the bits and bytes are somebody else's problem, but I want to talk about things that are probably more your problem, specifically deletion and encryption. These have always been they've always been around when it comes to forensics practice, and they've always been trouble. Are you seeing, as we see technology advance and we see the diversity of data storage advance and blow up, are you seeing more sophisticated attempts to either obfuscate or hide or get rid of data? And is that giving you a need to have new methodologies as to how you track down what might not be there now but used to be there?
Yeah, I would say to answer the question of deletion, I think our environment now is really poor for the forensic analyst. In other words, in the old days, we could go into Slack space and carve for data and capture it, and then we could create by identifying headers and footers and things like that. We could recreate documents that had been in part deleted due to the fact that deletion on spinning drives was random. So we could go in there and find documents, even though it may not have the pointer in a database telling you like a table of contents where the data was. We could find it through search vernacular and keywords and things like that. Now, with solid state drives in place and double deletion and things like that, the notion of deletion is becoming harder and harder for us to retrieve information. Most times, frankly, if it's outside the recycle bin, if someone has actually flushed twice, then you really can't get it. So the idea of getting deletion is becoming more difficult, not less. In the case of mobile devices, we're having to do full file system extracts to get deleted content. Almost no deleted content comes with standard logical acquisitions when doing mobile device collections.
So let me ask you then, what does the world of forensic investigations look like? Because it's interesting you point that out. But it used to be very simple. Well, I mean, I say simple, it wasn't, but you're right. You used to go and you'd image a workstation, and you'd go in and you'd carve out that space, and you'd find things, etc. We deal with matters where people hide information inside of Discord, which is, I thought it was just a gaming chat application, but as it turns out, sometimes it's utilized as well to have private communication. So, I mean, what are you seeing as far as the future of forensic investigations if we're living in this world of WeChat, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, all of these signal, everything that I think everyone is starting to realize, or those people that want to be clever, I think, are realizing that I could create data and have it disappear. And I'm not saying, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the utilization of any of what are called ephemeral messaging applications, meaning I send a message and it disappears, I'm not suggesting that there's any nefarious purpose for it whatsoever. In fact, if you research the case law actually goes on both sides to say that there could potentially be a good business purpose for doing it, such as maybe you're saving storage capacity or what have you. But Steve, I mean, if everyone's going to use ephemeral messaging applications, where does that leave you in your job?
Yeah, it makes it more difficult, clearly, to do what we have to do. I mean, you have to be a little more creative and you have to be a little more of a sleuth to come through and try to find data. So ephemeral, I mean, it's a cool word and everyone loves it. And it really just means transient. So basically data that's there one day and then not there the next. And it's not, I always make the joke, it's not like Mission Impossible where it blows up in your hands at the end of the convo. I mean, what happens is it's a setting, it's configuration. They just give you a super short leash on your data. And so the data goes away. So what does that do? I mean, if the data's not there, the data's not there. And if we can't carve for it, like we talked about it, it would sound like we're out of luck, but not necessarily. There's two primary ways around that. One would be, in my case, if you go to my phone and you look at Discord or Telegram or Signal or something like that, all my messages are on my phone still to this day. Why? Because I don't enable the configurations or the settings to have it disappear after X period of time. Because in my business, I need to have it. I may be testifying on it downstream. Someone maybe questioned me about what I did, what was the predicate, why I chose to do the things I do. So I retain my data. So if you and I and Brandon were in a chat together and you guys had settings that made things eradicate or disappear, and I didn't, even if Brandon was a subject of an investigation, arguably we could get to the communication via my phone, just not his app and his credentials. Secondarily, there's a concept of syncing or um, backups, things like that. Every time my wife comes in my office and sits down, she has a newer iPhone than I do, so she has a different connector, right? Different lightning cord. She plugs it in, on my screen pops up, do you want to make a sync? So every single time she's attaching to a Mac device, it's syncing and making a backup, which is just good practice, giving you the latest and greatest, updating your software, getting you the latest music when you work out, all that. But we now have a place to look. So if she went in and deleted a bunch of data from her phone after that time and we couldn't find it, remember, even though it may sync to the app itself, it won't open up a backup and take out those messages that were later deleted. So there are intermediate signposts along the way that allow you to get back to it, either rebuilding Humpty Dumpty through other conversations, the same way you would do with an email thread. If you left an employee of an enterprise, Daniel, and you didn't have your email anymore and they didn't save it, they didn't make an alias and send it to another person in your company, but all your communications for fun were with Brandon and me, we could go to our email boxes and at least try to rebuild a lot of that communication that we couldn't get from you. Same concept here by either going to other participants or going to syncs and backups.
So, Steve, anybody who's paying attention to eDiscovery knows that generative AI is the big topic of the year, and it's been making a big splash across legal altogether. But most of what I see and hear and read about Gen AI is about the review space. We're really focused on the right hand of the EDRM and how we can use Gen AI to reduce costs there. When it comes to forensics, are you seeing real applications of Gen AI now? And if you are seeing them and tech is being developed around that for forensics, where are you seeing the most promising avenues for Gen AI to help with what you do day to day?
So I've had this question posed to me on several occasions in the last couple of years. My answer has been consistent. I'm going to change it today. So up till now, what I've said is, you know what? I'm not that sold that generative AI is going to impact my lifestyle for the next 10, 15 years, as long as I plan on practicing. I don't think it's going to impact me. And I think I'm dead wrong. I've kind of learned over time that there's actually some super interesting things that are happening that could really be a huge change to the way we do what we call exfiltration or migration investigations. So I think the single biggest area for me, I used to think it was going to be an identification of data sources and devices, but we can still do that pretty handily just chatting with people. I think the cross-referencing, either from a geolocational standpoint or when you have people that are attaching USBs to drives or networks or computers, and then you're trying to trace and track data that may have started somewhere, then got on a conduit, and then landed somewhere else. That's the whole genesis of doing a migration analysis. You can now use all the artifacts, which are numerous on both PC and Mac-based operating systems. We can now use those artifacts and cross-reference. It used to be we'd get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code that the analyst would then have to go in and utilize products to create a timeline. And then they'd have to make judgments and choices about whether something that existed in and around a time a thumb drive had been placed into a device, whether that might have been copied there or not. Now, with AI, I see huge functionality to that cross-referencing and boiling down, and this is really the benefit of AI, is taking hundreds and millions of pages or documents or lines of code and doing the heavy lifting for you and creating maybe questions, not answers, about do you think this is related to this? Or could it be that what I'm seeing here on this date, all of a sudden we saw 30,000 items get deleted from the hard drive in and around the same time they had something just plugged in. Now, it doesn't necessarily give you black and white facts, but what it does is it introduces conceptually some things that would have taken hours and hours or days and days. So I think there's tremendous functionality in investigative techniques that we use, and I'm sure, and I'm not going to name all the products that are out there, but they're all pretty renowned that could be using that or developing it. And behind the scenes, when I speak to people, those are things they're doing. Like it's not just about connectors anymore. Now it's also going to be about investigation rapidity and trying to help analysts get to the goal line faster.
Well, that's interesting because one of the areas of discoverability now is talking about the prompts that people are inputting into these Gen AI tools. So on an enterprise level, we take a look at tools like, Relativity or Everlaw, et cetera. Relativity in particular has a connector that allows you to get into enterprise ChatGPT to, be able to bring in those prompts. I'm sure you'll correct me on this, Steve, about whether or not that's forensically sound or not to utilize it as a connector. But now I'm starting to think about, well, what about all the custodians who are utilizing a non-enterprise version of a Gen AI tool, and it becomes known that a particular custodian was working on a commercial or on a consumer level Gen AI tool and asked how to fraud the company, right? How do you How do we go about discovering that? I mean, are we there now, Steve, where we are going to just go start discovering, on a personal workstation that somebody has, or on a work workstation, the consumer grade level Gen AI tools to discover and collect all of the prompts?
Yeah, so there's three categories of data you can get from AI platforms. One is clearly the prompts, and it's one that everyone's very interested in. Number two is the output, of course, the answer that it gave you, and it may be consistent and may be dynamic. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I get on these things, and one day I search and get one answer, and the next day I search and get a different answer. And it's not necessarily a hallucination, but it's not math. It's not consistent. Like I'm a stats guy, so I want consistency. I want the same answer every time I get the same variables and the same constants put into an equation. And you don't get that today. But that's the second category. And then the third one's really the source code of the way the large language model operates. Okay. So there's really three distinct categories of data. Can you get them today? Yes, you can with the appropriate credentials or admin permissions. You can get to them legally. Luckily not my argument, to have to make, but if you point me in the right direction and I have the authority and permissions to do it, we can, because these are once again structured databases and we're dealing with really textual or linear data, which is pretty easy to manage. So we can get prompts, we can get source code just like you could if someone came in and stole the code for another program and underwrite it, and you can get the output, and then you can also test the output. So we can get it, and it's not a particularly heavy lift, and it's not a large data set either, if you think about it, because you're dealing with this textual information. You're not dealing with more complex structures of data.
Steve, I've seen one of your presentation topics that you titled "Where in the World is the Easy Button?" And it's a great catchphrase. I think it's one of those things that those of us in service industries, we've all had that sentiment, that feeling where there's an expectation coming from the person we're working with as to what we can really get done. And they thought it would be easier or simpler, or more direct than what it really is. And in the world of forensics, I'm sure you run into that a lot. And I'm curious, how do you manage the expectations of your clients? Where are you seeing the biggest gaps between what they expect you to be able to do and what you really can? And how do you prep them for that?
I'd say my last couple years in the business, I've been kind of consumed on this topic. And kind of because people that I've met at shows or people that have engaged us or people that have been recommended to use me, and they're like, oh, he's great, best thing since sliced bread. And then we get into an engagement, they're like, great, just grab that stuff and bring it on over, and we want to look at it. And start asking a lot of questions and like, okay, can you like just get going? I mean, I really appreciate your thoroughness, but really would like you to get going. And I'm like, no, I can't yet because I need answers on all these things. And I think that disconnect leads to frustration, sometimes from either end clients or practitioners that are in the business of collecting data, minimizing data, and then reviewing data. They want to jump from that, grab the data, and then just give me a few things out of it. And it's a process. It is an entire workflow to do that. And if you don't stop up front and talk about what you're up against, then you're going to be halfway down the hill with no way back up. When you talk about, well, I'm not finding what I want to see. I had a client that collected Slack data, and I said, we can help you on that. We have a third-party tool that we use. We can use the native API. We can go in and get in there. I said it really depends on what licensing subscription you have and whether or not they're utilizing, private or public channels. And it matters whether there's group messages or, individual direct messages. And they're like, yeah, don't worry about any of that. Just we're going to have our IT guy grab it and we're going to send it to you. And when they did that, it stripped all the attachments out because they didn't have an upgraded version for business enterprise. And then they're like, why the heck didn't you get the attachments? And so that kind of what came first, the egg, right, or the chicken? Same thing we run into here. If you don't spend the time up front of identifying what you're up against, can you ever detail a plan? And that disconnect is led to people being disappointed, not so much in me or Purpose Legal or some other company. It's just in the process itself. They think that it should be easier because that would be nice for them. And to hear it's more complex and to have people lay out the litany of steps along the way is painstaking sometimes for them. And I think they, lose interest. And you made a comment about my ability to communicate this stuff. I had a person at a major automobile company come to me after a show one day, and he said, "You know what you do well, and it's not that you're particularly bright or anything. It's that what you do well is you communicate something that can be so complex into a super conversational, easy way to understand." And that's my gift, if I had any, is conceptually I understand it. I'm not that hyper technical. I have people that are way smarter than me that can, go in and code in ways I never could in my lifetime. But I understand what you're trying to do, and I understand how to get there, and I can communicate that. And I think if you can bridge that gap between expectation, like you said, Brandon, and then not having disappointment down the line because you actually understand this is like getting a phone. How long does it take to collect a phone? How long is a piece of string, right? I mean, I don't know. It can be a mile long or it can be a foot long. Well, a phone, how long does it take to get a phone? Just tell me. My client wants to know. And I can tell him on average it might be an hour or two, but there's times I've had that with real estate professionals that had tons and tons of attachments where it's taken 4 days to collect a phone. And it's not because I'm good or bad at what I do. That's just life in the big city. It's not, you just can't get to New York in 2 minutes as much as I want to. I've got to go through the process. And so that then raises the issue you did earlier, which is how do we mitigate? How do we minimize? How do we make sure, and so I always say, like, if you have 30 custodians, maybe we look at one or two of them, right? If they've got a phone and a tablet and a computer, we had somebody the other day that had 4 computers and they were looking for an exfiltration thing. And I was like, the chances of us finding anything on 4 computers, taking all the live user data and then analyzing it is negligible. My suggestion would be let's look at some communication centric analyses and start there and do an iterative approach. And so I think to answer both of your earlier questions, I think iteration is kind of the answer. I don't think you can eat the whole thing at one fell swoop. I think you have to start. I used to make the joke, like, how much cocaine do you have to find at the border? Like, you don't have to find like 30 bricks of it. I mean, you can find a little bag and that may be enough to indict somebody. And the same thing here. We don't need every bad thing that an actor did necessarily, but we want things that are exemplary. So we want to be able to find items that will, support our allegations or our position in a case. And so I think you've got to not try to do the full meal deal anymore. I think you need to be more thoughtful and do it in a step-by-step process. And you may get enough information, just like you would with a review. Like once you feel like the things that are coming back from a review aren't that responsive, then maybe you stop the review and it hits a certain level. Same concept here.
I'm thinking about that comment that the person came up to you from the automotive manufacturing company, and that was either the best compliment ever or the worst backhanded compliment. I'm not quite sure which one. I'm still going through that in my head just now. But there is something to be said, of course, about being able to take highly complex topics and break it down to very simple, which I would argue you have to actually be bright in order to do that. Purpose Legal has been coming back to NeLI. You've been coming back to NeLI for a couple of years now, and in fact, you guys were gold sponsors this past year. What is it about the conference that keeps you coming back, and how is it different? You are on the speaker circuit, so how is it different from other events you attend throughout the year?
Yeah, I think I use the word boutique. I think it's a very boutique-ish type show. It doesn't have 10,000 people. And there's a famous show that we all go to that I used to call it cockroaches in a box, people crawling all over each other, trying to get somewhere. I mean, not trying to be unseemly, but it kind of is what it is. It's hard to have a voice or make any noise or have anything resonate when you're in an environment like that. Okay. I think the beauty of NeLI is the people behind it, and you can pat yourself on the back on this one, is the board's great. They're all practitioners. They're all involved day in and day out. And the thing I love about it is they don't tell you, they ask you. And they like conjecture, they like interaction. I love the fact that they bring in a series of judges that give us their position, which is radically different from mine or yours, any of us, from where we come from. mean, they're giving us the legal side of it and the practical implications for what they're going to have to do in the future. And I find those to be gold. You're walking away with just like trinkets of gold when you get to listen to them and then interact with them and then speak with them. And I think that boutique environment where there's hundreds and not thousands allows that type of exchange. And I would say program wise, there's very little filler. We're not putting like, it's like when you get a lobster roll, like I don't want, or crab cake, I don't want all the filler. I want the real stuff, right? And it's the same concept here is you kind of get from the moment we get there to the moment we leave. It's almost you have to make wise choices on how you're going to spend your time. It's not like I'm going to kill an hour with this next presentation. So it's very novel. Like I said, the people behind it are outstanding. They do this every single day. And it's kind of an extension since so many of the people are from Sedona Conference that we get to deal with kind of latest and greatest things that people are writing papers on right now, speaking on, educating. I always take away more from that specific conference than I do than any when I go to probably, I try not to go that many because I don't really love traveling all the time, but 5 to 7 a year, and I consider that kind of the platinum or gold star, or whatever you think the highest grade is.
Well, Steve, as we wrap up, what's one piece of advice that you would give to legal professionals who are trying to keep pace with all of this, everything in the world of forensics? What's the one thing that you would say they need to focus on as we move into 2026?
I'd say get yourself a Steve or a Brandon or a Daniel, whoever you deem to know stuff. I think this type of relationship stuff, relationship building where you can pick up a phone or ping somebody or ask a question. The thing that is very self-deprecating, but I find outstanding about the forensic industry is it's a community. And I don't know everything. You guys don't know everything. You can't know everything. I mean, things happen daily that I didn't even see coming a week or two ago. And so the ability to pick up and talk to somebody in law enforcement or somebody that's a competitor of mine and say, have you seen this before? And does this ever happen to you? And have you read anything about this? I mean, there's stuff literally happening that people on our team come to me and they're like, did you know that you can't use X, Y, and Z program anymore to collect WhatsApp off an Android? And I'm like, nope, no idea. And then you start to investigate and you do empirical studies and testing to find out. But I think get yourself a network, a community, whether it's from LinkedIn, whether it's from NeLI, whether it's just friendships of people that you've added to your network. It's the old Rolodex, right? I mean, you have to have that group of people. I got brought into LinkedIn years ago. I'm not a big joiner. I think you probably get that flavor. I'm not a big joiner. I don't necessarily I scored on a test in the 99th percentile for being in front of people, and I scored in the 1 percentile in interest in doing it. Like I'm kind of a homebody. I kind of like doing projects and I like investigations and I don't really like speaking that much. And you're like, shut up. That's all you do is speak, right? But I do okay at it. It's just like not my thing. So I say find yourself somebody you can rely on, find a community, find resources the same way that when my kids are like, well, how do you put this together? And I'm like, do you have YouTube? Like, if you have YouTube, you can probably figure out how to hook up the new Samsung TV on the wall. I mean, or I can Google it for you either way, but there are sources and techniques and people out there. You just got to connect with them.
Well, Steve, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast today. I speak for all of us, including the audience who's not here today, that you've given us a number of different nuggets today about what's going on in forensics and what we should be focused on. So thank you for taking the time and spending it with us this afternoon.
It's great to see you guys. I always enjoy it and appreciate you. Look forward to next time our paths cross.
If you've enjoyed our discussion and want to learn more, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite streaming platform. We're here to help you stay on top of the latest trends and developments in eDiscovery.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about today's topic. Reach out to us via our social media channels or email us directly. Your feedback makes our program stronger and more attuned to the topics you care about in the world of legal technology.
Remember, all the resources and insights shared today are aimed at enhancing your practice and understanding of eDiscovery.
Join us next time on NeLI Pod as we continue to bring you expert knowledge and lively discussions. Until then, keep innovating, keep discovering, and keep pushing the boundaries of legal technology. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.